Okay, we are going to get started on chapter 52, which is an introduction to ecology and the biosphere. So, let me get this out of your way. Okay. Ecology. So, again, this is the beginning of the last few chapters of our book. Ecology is the scientific study of the interactions between organisms and the living and non-living components of their environment. So let's think about what that means. So organisms, living organisms like us or other species, and how they interact with living, which is biotic, or non-living, which is abiotic components of their environment. So we know that those interactions are very important and they help to determine the distribution of organisms like us and other species and how many of those organisms are present. So these interactions can be studied by ecologists, and they can be organized in the hierarchy that we talked about at the very beginning of our time together, when we started at looking at subatomic particles all the way up through the biosphere. So we're going to talk about what some of those higher order hierarchical categories are, that range from individual organisms all the way up to the planet, to the biosphere. So this is looking at, again, at the top here is starting where ecology begins. So there's organismal ecology, so the organism itself, population ecology, so groups of one individual species, communities, that would be all the living things in a particular area and how they influence each other. The ecosystem is going to add the abiotic or non-living things to the interactions and how they work together. Landscape ecology, we're going to talk about how the features of the landscape or the location play a role in affecting living and non-living things in the particular area. And then, of course, your whole biosphere, so global ecology as well. So again, starting at the bottom level of what ecology will look like, organismal ecology, again, looking at one particular organism's structure, the physiology, so how do the pieces and parts of this particular organism work, and specifically for animals, what is the behavior that they have that helps them to meet environmental challenges? So organismal ecology can include physiological, evolutionary, and behavioral ecologies. There's a lot of variation in terms of things that can be studied. Population ecology, remember, populations are groups of one species that are living in one particular area. So population ecology will focus on the factors affecting this particular population and its size over time. So again, here's a pink flamingo. Here's a population of pink flamingos in that one particular area. Communities, so remember, moving up the hierarchy, a community is different than a population because it's groups of populations, meaning all of the different species in one particular area and how they work together or don't. Community ecology will look at the effect of the interactions between the species and how these interactions affect community structure and organization. So this is showing you an example of a community here. So again, we were talking about populations of flamingos, but in the area where they live, there also are zebras and other types of birds and other types of animals, animals in the water. So these are all things, right, that will influence what's happening to this specific population that we're looking at, in this case, the flamingos. So communities, all the species in one particular area. Moving up, we get to ecosystems. So ecosystem is the community of organisms, so all of the living species in that one particular area and the physical factors in that area with which they interact. So ecosystem ecology will emphasize energy flow, and chemical cycling between the organisms and the environment. So energy flow, remember energy flows through an ecosystem where chemicals and nutrients cycle within the system. So things like the water cycle, the nitrogen cycle, and for energy, thinking of, again, sunlight being converted via photosynthesis into sugars and then eaten by consumers and then passed on to decomposers or detritivores. Landscape ecology, or sometimes called a seascape if we're talking about watery environments, is a mosaic of connected ecosystems. So landscape ecology will focus on exchanges of energy, materials, and organisms across multiple ecosystems. So you can, again, have different ecosystems that work together or influence each other. So again, we can see various ecosystems here. So we have mountainous area, we have a water environment here, and then we also have a coastal marshy area. So all of these together would be what we would describe as landscape ecology, where ecosystem by itself would just be the mountain area or just be the water environment or the coastal region here. And then at the highest level, you have your biosphere. That's the global ecosystem. So that's going to be the sum of all the planet's ecosystems and landscapes. And the ecologists that study global ecology will examine the influence of energy and materials on all the organisms across the biosphere. So this is looking at it sort of at a very big picture view and thinking about how things influence each other, either positively or negatively. Okay, so looking at this idea of weather versus climate, and these are terms that really are important to understand when we're thinking about the big picture for global ecology. So the climate of the Earth, of our biosphere, will vary by latitude and season, and is changing rapidly. So it does change day to day. And that has to do a lot with the position of the sun and the position of the Earth relative to the sun. So we'll talk about that. Climate is long-term prevailing weather conditions in one particular area will constitute its climate. So climate is a little more constant than weather. Weather is day-to-day changes in is it rainy? Is it sunny? What is the temperature? Versus climate, where we have a typical high or typical low for this area for this time of year, this much precipitation at this time of year. Climate does change over time, and we know, again, we're encountering greater levels of climate change due to man-made forces, so man-made gases and effects of Homo sapiens on the Earth. Four major physical components of climate are temperature, precipitation, sunlight, and wind. So global climate patterns are determined largely by solar energy and the Earth's movement in space relative to the sun. So the warming effect of the sun establishes temperature variations, circulation of the air and the water, and evaporation of water, which becomes important for weather and climate. So the position of the Earth and Earth's movement causes latitudinal variations in climate. So what that means is as you move away from the equator, the climate will change dramatically based on the location of the sun and also the time of the year. So the latitudinal variation depends on the angle at which the sunlight hits the Earth. So it's going to affect the intensity or the amount of heat and light per unit of surface area. The intensity of the sunlight is strongest in the tropics. So again, the equator would be at 0 degrees latitude, and the tropics are described as 23.5 degrees north of the equator and 23.5 degrees south of the equator. So in that middle region is what we would call the tropics, and that's where the sunlight strikes the earth most directly. So if you look at this picture here, again, you can see that our earth is not quite a circle. It's a little bit ovoid, but circular. Or round-ish, I guess. Here's your equator. Again, that's your 0 degrees latitude. So the sun would be directly overhead at the equinoxes. So the autumnal and the vernal equinoxes are, again, varying points in season changes. As we move away from the equator, again, 23.5 degrees north, that's the Tropic of Cancer, 23.5 degrees south, Tropic of Capricorn. So this area between is what we would describe as the tropics. You can see that you have a greater amount of sunlight coming directly to these regions, which generally means it's going to be warmer in this area. When we get farther away from the equator, the angle of the sunlight is reduced. So you have a lower angle of that incoming sunlight. So you get colder and colder as you get farther away from the equator, either south or north. So you have your North Pole at 90 degrees and your South Pole at 90 degrees south here. This always reminds me of Jimmy Buffett's song, Changes in Latitudes, Changes in Attitudes. So as you start to move, right, say you live somewhere in a cold area and you change your latitude, typically, I think he is speaking of changing from a colder place to a warmer place, but perhaps the other way as well, moving from a hot place to a colder place. Essentially just going on vacation, really, is what I think what he's talking about. But again, that's your latitude in relationship to the amount of sun that you're going to see on the earth. Okay. Global air circulation and precipitation patterns also play major roles in determining climate patterns. Water will evaporate in the tropics, and the warm, wet air masses will flow from the tropics towards the poles. These rising air masses will release water and cause high precipitation, especially in the tropics. So often have very high amounts of rain in the tropics. So we end up with tropical rainforests in these particular areas, which we'll talk about. The dry descending air masses create arid climates, especially near 30 degrees north and south. So we often end up with desert environments. Deserts can be cold or warm depending on their location, but these deserts are defined by the amount of rainfall or precipitation that they get each year. So the air that flows close to the Earth's surface creates predictable global wind patterns, and you have prevailing winds in certain directions depending on the latitude that you find yourself in the biosphere. So again, looking at how the zones work in terms of airflow. So as air flows, here's again 0 degrees, that's your equator. You can see that these warm air masses will rise. That's going to release large amounts of moisture in these areas. Then we have drier air that will descend and come down. So you end up again with these desert environments or more arid, dry zones near 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south as well. Again, you can see that you have westerly winds, so between 60 degrees south, 30 degrees south, also 60 and 30 in the north, you have westerly winds. So typically, and we see that if you look at how weather patterns move over the United States, typically we see that those weather patterns and winds will move from west to east. So we look to the west of us to see what kind of rainfall or what kind of temperatures we might be expecting in the next few days. And then in the middle, you can see that you have southeast trade winds, northeast trade winds in the north. So all of these things are going to be important in helping to determine what's going on with weather, climate, and precipitation. So climate will vary seasonally and is modified by other factors, including large bodies of water and also mountain ranges. They play a role in regional and local effects on climate too.